Okay, so you know how we're always trying to like wrap our heads around really complicated stuff
Yeah.
and like really get to the bottom of things? Have you ever thought about like what happens when you try to explain those same super intricate ideas, but to someone who's like incredibly intelligent?
Oh, like a real genius type.
Exactly. It's kind of like the ultimate test of whether you really understand something yourself.
Yeah. It's kind of like you have to prove it to someone who can totally see through any BS.
That's exactly what we're going to deep dive into today. We're going to explore this whole concept of explaining things to really bright minds through the work of Michel de Montaigne. You know, those thought-provoking essays he wrote back in 16th century France.
Oh, yeah, Montaigne. His essays are just packed with these personal reflections and philosophical musings. Super interesting stuff.
They really are. And, you know, he lived in a really dynamic period of history, so his writings tackle all these timeless questions about learning, about understanding things, and about how we communicate and share knowledge with each other. You know what I mean?
Yeah, he was grappling with some pretty fundamental stuff that's still relevant today.
Exactly. So our mission in this deep dive is to uncover how Montaigne approached these things, like explaining, learning, and sharing knowledge. What can we learn from his insights, written centuries ago, about how to effectively communicate with someone, let's say, with genius-level intellect? Because, and here's the thing, even the most brilliant minds, they can still benefit from having things explained clearly and from hearing fresh perspectives, even on ideas they might already be familiar with.
Absolutely. I mean, a genius might grasp things quickly, but sometimes it's the act of explaining something to someone else that really helps solidify their own understanding. It's like by having to put their thoughts into words and structure it logically, it can reveal even deeper layers of the concept for everyone involved.
Okay, yeah, I totally get that. So let's unpack this a little bit.
Yeah.
To me, Montaigne always comes across as this like perpetual student, constantly looking inwards, examining himself. You know, he has that famous quote, do thine own work and know thyself. So what's the connection between understanding yourself and being able to explain something effectively, especially to someone with a super sharp mind?
Well, I think what's important here, if you're thinking about how to explain something to a really bright person, is that Montaigne saw introspection, like really knowing yourself, as the very foundation of clear communication. It's like by deeply understanding your own assumptions, your own way of thinking and processing information, you become way better at articulating your thoughts in a way that other people, especially those who are really smart, can understand and connect with. It reduces the chances of misunderstandings, you know?
Right, right. So it's like you're more aware of your own blind spots and biases so you can better anticipate how someone else might interpret what you're saying. That makes a lot of sense. Now, Montaigne also had this idea about wisdom being rooted in the present moment. He said, wisdom, acquiescing in the present, is never dissatisfied with itself. How does that idea, that focus on the present, connect with the challenge of explaining complex stuff, especially to someone with a really powerful intellect, someone who might be drawn to abstract possibilities and what-ifs?
So, connecting this to your goal of explaining something clearly, I think Montaigne's point is that true understanding isn't about constantly chasing after some future, more perfect knowledge. It's about fully grasping and engaging with the core principles right here, right now. Even a genius, someone who's really good at abstract thinking, needs to have a solid foundation in the present reality of the concept you're trying to explain.
So it's more about clarity and a rock-solid understanding of the fundamentals in the present moment and less about, dazzling them with all these hypothetical future
Yeah,
applications.
exactly.
Okay, now let's talk about Montaigne's own education, because it was quite unusual, wasn't it? Like, his father went to great lengths to make learning enjoyable, even waking up with music. Pretty cool, huh?
Yeah, his dad was ahead of his time for sure. The whole idea was to nurture a genuine love of learning, make it engaging and voluntary rather than a chore. You know, there's that story about his Greek lessons being like games. That really illustrates this approach. And if you think about how to explain something to a super smart person, it emphasizes how important it is to make the learning process itself enjoyable and personally relevant, regardless of how intellectually gifted they are.
Yeah, I love that story about the Greek lessons as games. It's such a great example of how, even for a mind that can absorb information like super fast, the way it's presented can make all the difference in the world.
Right.
But then, later on, Montaigne goes to this prestigious college, the College of Guyenne, has access to all these brilliant tutors, and by his own admission, doesn't exactly shine academically. What happened there?
Well, this brings up a really important point. Even with all the best resources and teachers, Montaigne attributed his less than stellar performance to what he called his slow wit and poor memory. So it shows us that intelligence alone isn't the only factor in learning right. Each person has their own internal processing style, their own pace of understanding, and that matters a lot. When you're explaining something to a genius, remember that they too have their unique way of taking in and making sense of information.
Yeah, it reminds us that access to brilliant teachers and top-notch education isn't some magic bullet.
Yeah.
What really matters is how the individual interacts with the material and processes it for themselves.
Definitely.
Okay, let's switch gears a little bit and delve into Montaigne's thoughts on what true knowledge really is. He's pretty clear that there's a big difference between simply memorizing facts and deeply understanding something. He says, that which a man rightly knows and understands, he's the free disposer of at his own full liberty. What does that mean when it comes to explaining something to, let's say, a genius?
Well, this really highlights Montaigne's emphasis on the difference between simply recalling facts and actually internalizing knowledge. If someone truly understands a concept, they can use it flexibly, apply it to different situations without constantly having to go back to the source material. So when you're trying to explain something to a genius, focus on conveying that deep, usable understanding, not just a bunch of facts they could probably find on their own.
Right. It's like showcasing the real-world application of the knowledge, its potential, not just its existence in a textbook.
Right. It's like give them the so what of the knowledge.
I like that. Now, to illustrate this idea, he uses that really cool analogy of bees collecting nectar to make their own honey. How does that analogy play into this whole idea of taking information and transforming it into something that's truly your own?
Okay, so this analogy really emphasizes the active role of the learner in creating their own understanding. Just like bees transform nectar into honey, we should take in information, process it through our own intellectual framework, and synthesize it into something uniquely our own. When you're explaining something to a genius, you're not just presenting the raw facts like the nectar because they can get that anywhere. You're sharing your honey, your distilled understanding and insights, the way you've processed and made sense of the information.
It's like you're offering them a taste of your unique intellectual honey.
Exactly.
Now, another interesting thing is that Montaigne was pretty critical of what he called bookish learning, saying it was superficial. How does that fit into this challenge of explaining things to someone who's incredibly intelligent and who likely has a ton of book knowledge already?
Well, for Montaigne, knowledge that came solely from books, without any real-world application or deep personal reflection, lacked a solid foundation. So, for you, this means that explaining to a genius requires more than just spouting off theories and facts. You need to bring in insights, connect those concepts to practical scenarios, go beyond the abstract.
Show them that you've really grappled with the material, gone beyond just reading about it.
Exactly. They're probably looking for substance, not just a rehash of theories they've already encountered in books.
Okay, so let's shift gears a bit and talk about the art of communication itself.
Mm.
Montaigne describes his own writing style as rough, free, and irregular, and he even admits to sometimes being obscure in his brevity. Pretty honest self-assessment, right?
Yeah, it's refreshing, actually, and it highlights something really important. Even super brilliant minds can struggle to communicate perfectly clearly. Montaigne recognized that sometimes trying to be concise could actually make things less clear.
Brevity isn't always clarity.
No, not always. And this is a good reminder that when you're explaining complex ideas, even to someone who's really quick on the uptake, you still have to be careful about how you articulate things, and you've got to anticipate where they might get tripped up.
No mind reading aloud.
Right.
But at the same time, Montaigne was also a big advocate for using plain language and relatable examples, even drawing from everyday life. Why is that so crucial, even when you're speaking to someone with exceptional intelligence?
Because even a genius can appreciate a clear, down-to-earth explanation. Using everyday examples makes abstract ideas more tangible and accessible, and it creates a common point of reference. It's about making even the most complex concepts feel grounded and less abstract.
So it's like anchoring those big ideas in the real world, using things everyone can relate to. I like that. Montaigne also talked about testing his own understanding through writing. He said, "I have no more made my book than my book has made me." How does this self-reflective act of putting your thoughts into words actually help you get better at explaining things to others, especially to a genius?
Well, think of it this way. Writing forces you to organize your thoughts, clarify your arguments, and see where your own understanding might be shaky. It's like a rigorous self-examination. By getting those ideas out on paper, you become way better at articulating them to others, including someone with a super sharp mind. The clarity you gain for yourself will translate into clearer explanations for your audience.
Yeah, it's like a test run for your thoughts. Okay, last but not least, let's talk about Montaigne's views on quoting other people. He seemed to value the essence of an idea over who originally said it. He said, "Truth and reason are common to everyone." What does that tell us about explaining things to someone with genius-level intellect who probably has a huge knowledge base of different sources and authorities?
It suggests that when you're talking to a genius, the focus should be on the logic and strength of the idea itself, not on who said it first. A sharp mind will appreciate a well-reasoned argument, regardless of whether it comes from a famous scholar or, your next-door neighbor.
Substance over the source.
Exactly.
Okay, last point. Let's talk about humility. Montaigne often admitted his own ignorance and the fact that his memory wasn't perfect. He famously said, "The confession of ignorance is one of the finest and surest testimonies of judgment that I know." How does that intellectual humility play into explaining things to a genius?
It creates an atmosphere of honesty and openness. Admitting what you don't know shows that you're not pretending to have all the answers, and when you're talking to a genius, that can actually make them more receptive to what you do have to say.
It's about leveling the playing field and acknowledging that everyone has limits to their knowledge.
Exactly.
Montaigne also talked about wanting to be unplumed by clear understanding and better judgment. That seems to suggest that he was open to having his own ideas challenged and refined. How can you, or anyone for that matter, cultivate that same mindset, especially when interacting with someone who's exceptionally intelligent?
I think it's about being willing to let go of your ego. If you're genuinely seeking truth and understanding, you have to be open to the possibility that you might be wrong, that your ideas could be improved. And a true genius, someone who's constantly pushing the boundaries of knowledge, is likely to appreciate that kind of intellectual humility.
So it's about valuing progress over protecting your pride.
Yes.
And finally, Montaigne's preference for inquiry over definitive pronouncements. What does this mean? I understand it not. It may be. Is it true? Really underscores that open, collaborative spirit, doesn't it?
Absolutely. And it's something you can definitely apply when you're explaining something complex. Instead of just laying down the law, ask questions, admit when you're uncertain, and encourage a genuine back and forth exchange of ideas. That transforms the whole interaction into a shared intellectual journey where both people are actively trying to reach a deeper understanding.
So, to wrap things up, what are the key takeaways from Montaigne that we can apply when explaining something to a really bright mind?
I think the big takeaway is that it's not about dumbing things down or just throwing facts at them. It's about understanding the material deeply yourself, being able to communicate it clearly and relate it to real-world examples, and, most importantly, having the intellectual humility to admit what you don't know and be open to learning from the other person, even if they're a genius.
This deep dive into Montaigne has been so insightful. It's really made me rethink how we approach explaining complex ideas. And it's given me a lot to consider, especially when it comes to interacting with people who are exceptionally intelligent. It's not about the perceived gap in intellect, but rather about applying those fundamental principles of good communication and approaching the whole thing as a collaborative pursuit of understanding.
I totally agree. And honestly, a lot of what Montaigne talks about isn't just relevant for explaining things to geniuses, it's relevant for any kind of learning and communication, regardless of who we're talking to.
That's such a great point. So to leave our listeners with something to ponder, consider this. How does the act of trying to explain something to someone you perceive as super intelligent actually sharpen your own understanding? Does the challenge of having to be extra clear and precise force you to think more deeply about the subject, maybe even reveal aspects you hadn't noticed before? It's a really interesting dynamic, isn't it?
It is, and it just goes to show that learning is often a two-way street. By trying to teach or explain something, we often end up learning and growing just as much as the person we're trying to teach.
It's like Montaigne's idea of being unplumed. By sharing our knowledge and being open to feedback, we allow our own understanding to be refined and sharpened.
Exactly. It's a beautiful thing.
It really is.